A question I'd like to ask anybody with an Islamic background is this. You know, when the sun sets in the west every afternoon, do you believe that the sun sets in a spring of water? Is that true or is it false? If you are educated, you will say that is certainly false. The sun does not set in a spring of water. But in Muhammad's time, nobody knew where the sun went every afternoon. They saw the sun rising in the east in the morning and setting in the west every afternoon. And they had no idea where the sun was going until Copernicus and Galileo came along in the 1600s. Muhammad came along and Muhammad said, "I am a prophet of Allah." And people said to Muhammad, "Well, if you're a prophet of Allah, please tell us where does the sun go every afternoon?" At this point, Muhammad had two choices. The first choice he could make was he could say, "Well, I do not know where the sun goes," and people would say then, "You are a false prophet. You should know if you're a true prophet of Allah, and if you're a false prophet, you go to hell." But he didn't want them to think that. That would have damaged his claims of being a prophet. So the second choice Muhammad had was to guess or to make something up. And that's what he did in the Quran, Surah Kaf, or Surah 18, verses 83 down to verse 90. And in this passage he's talking about a historical character called Zulkarnain, which could be Alexander the Great. And it's Allah speaking because of the word say in 83. Say, "I shall recite to you something of his story. Verily, truly," this is meant to be a true historical account, "we, Allah, established him in the earth, and we, Allah, gave him the means of everything. So he followed a way," that means a road, "until when he reached the setting place of the sun, he found it, the sun, setting in a spring of black muddy hot water." Now, we notice the problem in verse 86 where he reached the setting place of the sun. We ask the question today, where is the setting place of the sun that the Quran tells us about? There is no setting place of the sun. The sun does not set in Tehran or Mecca or Moscow or Sydney. There is no place where the sun sets. That's the first big mistake in the Quran in this passage here. The second big mistake is it says that Zulkarnain found the sun setting in a spring of black muddy hot water. This, to an educated person, is completely false. The sun does not set in a spring of black muddy hot water. Muhammad did not know how far away the sun is, about 150 million kilometres, nor did Muhammad know how big the sun is, about 333,000 times more massive than the earth. He thought the sun's size was what appeared to the naked eye, and he thought the sun set in a spring of black muddy hot water. And he talks about the rising place of the sun, rising on a people for whom we provided no shelter. And so it was in 91 tells us that this is meant to be taken literally, not figuratively. Now, Islamic scholars will say, "Oh, this is all figurative, not literal." And I reply, well, if you think it's figurative, you show me one figurative word in this passage. It's completely literal. It's a literal Zulkarnain following a literal road, coming to a literal place where the sun sets, and seeing the literal sun setting in a literal spring of hot water with a literal people nearby, that he has a choice of punishing them or treating them with kindness. There's not one figurative word or thought in the passage. It's entirely literal, meant to be taken at face value. And so we look at this passage and we conclude four things. First, we conclude is this big mistake proves that the Quran is a false, fake, lying book. Secondly, this mistake proves that Muhammad is a false, fake, lying prophet. This mistake proves that Allah is a false, fake, lying God, not the true God, because the true God would never say something foolish as this, because he knows better. And it proves, fourthly, that Islam is a false, fake, lying religion, and you can throw Islam and the Quran in the rubbish tin of history. The second question I'd like to ask anybody with an Islamic background is, the Quran says in Surah 36, verse 38, Surah Yasin, the sun hastens to its resting place. I'd like to ask, where is the resting place of the sun? Does the sun rest in Sydney or New York or London or Mecca? No, there's no resting place for the sun. The sun does not go to sleep. People go to sleep and rest, but the sun does not. This also proves the Quran is a false book, and Muhammad's a false prophet, Allah's a false God, and Islam's a false religion, and you can reject it. The third question we'd like to ask anybody with an Islamic background who believes the Quran is the question of how does a baby develop in the mother's womb? In the Quran, in Surah Believers, number 23, verse 14, we read Allah speaking and telling us how a baby forms in mother's womb. Then we made the nutfa, or an embryo, into a clot, a piece of thick coagulated or dried blood, Then we made the clot into a little lump of flesh. Then we made out of that little lump of flesh bones. Then we clothed the bones with flesh. We ask the question here, what is a clot of thick coagulated blood? Well, if you cut your hand and blood comes out, you get a tissue and you dry the blood and it becomes dead blood, a scab, or dead blood cells. Now, we know a baby today forms through a sperm and an egg combining to give a fertilised egg or an embryo, a zygote. Now, this cell continues to divide and divide until a baby is born in 9 months. But you see, Mohammad did not have a microscope to look inside a mother's womb to see how a baby develops. He guessed, but he once again guessed wrong. He thought that the baby went through a stage, or passed through a stage of being thick, coagulated, dried blood. A baby did not pass through a stage of being dead blood cells or dried, coagulated blood. It was always living, dividing cells. This is another big mistake in the Quran. It proves the Quran's a false book, Muhammad's a false prophet, Allah's a false God, and Islam is a false religion, and we can reject with confidence Islam. Number 4, we read the true statement says that the stars are not closer to the earth than the sun or the moon. In Quran Surah Fusilat 41 verse 12 we read, "Then he," this is Allah, "completed and finished their creation of 7 heavens in 2 days, and he made in each heaven its affair, and we adorned the nearest lowest heaven with lamps or stars to be an adornment as well as to guard from the devils by using them as missiles against the devils." The first problem with this passage is it talks about 7 heavens, but the Quran never defines what these 7 heavens are. The Bible tells us there are 3 heavens: the atmosphere, birds fly in the heaven; second heaven is space, stars in the heaven; and the third heaven is where God's throne is and Christians die. We go to the third heaven. But there's a second mistake here, and it says, "We adorned the nearest lowest heaven with lamps or stars." Now, if the Quran said that the moon is in the lowest heaven, you and I would say, yes, that's fine, no problem, we won't argue with that. But it did not say the moon is in the lowest heaven. If the Quran secondly said that the sun is in the nearest heaven, you and I would say, well, we won't argue with that, it's pretty close. But it didn't say that either. It said that the stars are in the nearest lowest heaven. We adorn the nearest lowest heaven with lamps or stars. At this point we say wrong, completely and absolutely wrong. Muhammad did not know how far away the stars are, nor did he know how big the stars are. The nearest star is 4 light years away, about 40 trillion kilometres, and some of the distant stars are 13 billion light years. That is an unbelievably great distance. And some of the stars are many times bigger than our sun itself. And the stars are certainly not used as missiles to fire at the devils. This proves the Quran is a false book. It proves Muhammad is a false prophet. It proves Allah is a false God, and it proves Islam is a false religion, because Muhammad thought the stars' true size was what they appeared to the naked eye, whereas in reality they were much bigger and much further away than Muhammad ever thought. So educated people today would reject the Quran and Muhammad on this error alone. The 5th error in the Quran is in Surah Kahf, that's chapter 50, verse number 6. The true statement we want to make is that the sky is not a solid dome with no cracks in it. Muhammad did not know the sky was gas. Here we read in the Quran, "Have they not looked at the heaven above them, how we have made it and adorned it, and there are no rifts or cracks in it?" Now, the word rift or crack only applies to a solid object. A liquid like water cannot have a crack. A gas cannot have a crack like oxygen or nitrogen. You cannot have a crack in the atmosphere. So Muhammad looked up at the heaven and he made the comment that there are no rifts or cracks in the heaven or the sky. Now, this is completely and utterly wrong, because crack only applies to solid objects, and this shows that Muhammad was thinking that heaven is a roof that might have cracks but does not have cracks at all. And this proves the Quran is a false book. Number 6 error in the Quran, the true statement, the sky does not have a roof. Surah Prophets 21 verse number 12, "And we have made the heaven a roof, safe and well guarded." Here Allah is telling us that the heaven is a roof. A roof? Really? Where is the roof? How many kilometres up is the roof located? People with Islamic beliefs, tell us where the roof is. Muhammad thought that if you go up in a rocket, you will hit your head on the roof. And that's completely false. There's no roof above the atmosphere. It's purely oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide that fades into space, which is a vacuum. There's no roof. Sorry, Mohammed, you guessed, but you guessed wrong. This proves that Quran's a false book, Muhammad's a false prophet, Allah's a false God, and Islam's a false religion, and we can reject it with confidence. The seventh error, the true statement says that the heaven cannot fall onto the earth because the Quran in Surah Pilgrimage 22 verse 65, we read in the Quran, He, that's Allah, withholds or stops the heaven from falling on the earth except by his leave. So people asked Muhammad, well, if heaven is a roof with no cracks in it, what is holding up the roof? Something must be holding up the roof. It can't just be sitting there by itself. Something's got to be holding up the roof. What is it? Muhammad at this point did not know what is holding up the roof. So whenever he didn't know anything, he always would say something like, Allah stops the heaven from falling on the earth. Now this statement, if you think about it, is completely and utterly false. For the first reason, there is no roof, and secondly, it's not held up by Allah, it is pulled down by gravity. The atmosphere of oxygen and nitrogen and carbon dioxide is pulled down by gravity. It's not a case of Allah stopping it from falling onto the earth, it's fallen down by gravity, because there's no solid roof, it's a gaseous atmosphere of oxygen and nitrogen and CO2. So because of this mistake in the Quran, we can say that the Quran is a false book, Muhammad's a false prophet, this proves Allah is a false God, and it proves Islam is a false religion, and you can confidently reject Islam and the Quran and Muhammad. The eighth problem with the Quran is summarized by the true statement that hail does not come from heaven's mountains. If we look at Surah Light, number 24, verse 43, we read, From heaven's mountains he, this is Allah, sends down the hail, pelting it with whom he will, and turning it away from whom he pleases. We ask the question here, where is the hail coming from? People in Muhammad's time did not know where hail came from. Today we know that hail comes from water freezing in the clouds into ice particles which drop down onto the ground. But in Muhammad's time nobody knew where hail came from, so they asked Muhammad, where does hail came from? And once again Muhammad guessed, but he guessed wrong. He says from heaven's mountains he sends down the hail. Hail does not come from heaven's mountains. There are no mountains in the sky that drop down hail. Have you ever seen Mount Everest floating by and dropping down hail? Never. This is completely false. Muhammad guessed, but he guessed wrong again. And this proves four things. Number one, it proves the Quran's a false book. It proves Muhammad is a false prophet. It proves Allah is a false God. And Islam is a false religion, and you can confidently reject Islam and have a better life. The ninth error that we want to look at in the Quran is summarized by the statement, the earth is not flat as a bed. Surah Taha 20 verse 53 we read, Who, this is Allah, has made the earth for you like a bed spread out. The earth is not flat like a bed spread out. The earth is a ball or a sphere. Knowing what we know today, we would never say the earth is flat like a bed spread out. In Muhammad's time, people thought the earth was flat. But today we know that it's not flat, but it's a sphere. Muhammad guessed, but he guessed wrong, because that was a commonly held false belief of a flat earth in Muhammad's time. This proves Muhammad's a false prophet, it proves the Quran is a false book, it proves Allah is a false God, and it proves Islam is a false religion, and you can reject Muhammad, Islam, the Quran, and Allah with confidence. The 10th error we'd like to look at in the Quran is summarized by the statement, Earth is not fixed, but is moving through space. If we look at Surah Ant, number 27, verse 61, we read as follows, Is not He, Allah, better than your gods, who has made the earth as a fixed abode? Abode means a place to live. Now, the earth is not a fixed place. The earth is moving. The earth is spinning on its axis once every 24 hours. The earth is orbiting the sun once every 365 days. The earth is moving through space in the galaxy. To say that the earth is fixed is a false statement, and the true God would never make such a false statement as this. It feels fixed, but today we know it's not fixed, but it's spinning on its axis, orbiting the sun and moving through space. This proves the Quran's a false book, Muhammad's a false prophet, Allah's a false God, and Islam is a false religion, and we can reject Islam and the Quran and Muhammad and Allah with confidence and look for truth elsewhere.